Trump is pissed off at Putin, and now he's ready to hit where it hurts. The target? Russian oil. The weapon? Massive new tariffs that could shake global markets and rattle every country still doing business with Moscow. It's not just talk either. Trump's warning came fast and loud in a recent NBC interview, and it signals a turning point in US-Russia relations that could change everything from the battlefield in Ukraine to gas prices at your local pump. So, what pushed Trump over the edge? And how serious is this threat? It all started on March 30th when Trump sat down with NBC News. The US president was clearly in a bullish mood after hearing about recent comments made by Putin. Far from agreeing with Trump's calls for peace, Putin said on March 28th that he believes it's time for Ukraine to put a transitional administration in place, and if it doesn't, his military would finish off the Ukrainian troops. Ironically, Putin seems to be claiming that he would do all of this with the help from the very global system that punished him for starting the Ukraine invasion in the first place. Speaking on the sidelines of a recent Arctic forum, Russia's leader said he would discuss with the US, Russia's allies, and even Europe, under the auspices of the UN or United Nations, the possibility of establishing a transitional administration in Ukraine. What for? The Russian president asked rhetorically. To organize a democratic presidential election that would result in the coming to power of a competent government that would have the confidence of the people, and then begin negotiations with these authorities on a peace agreement and sign legitimate documents. Putin may have felt that he was playing to his strengths here. After all, it wasn't long ago that Trump was saying similar things about the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and his reign in the country. It was only on February 18th, in the aftermath of the meeting between envoys from Trump and Putin's parties in Saudi Arabia, that Trump was claiming that Zelensky was a dictator, whose approval rating in his own country had dropped to a measly 4%. Worse yet for Zelensky at the time, Trump claimed Ukraine's leader was doing a terrible job. Putin clearly thought he had Trump on his side after those comments, but a lot has changed since February 18th. Trump's team has met with Zelensky's in Saudi Arabia without Russian involvement. The two countries have come to agreements on ceasefires, while Putin has dragged his feet and tried to force additional conditions attached to any ceasefire to which he agrees. Russia's relationship with the US, which seemed stable less than 2 months ago, is now on shakier ground, as Trump seems to increasingly favor Zelensky thanks to Ukraine's leader's willingness to work with him. And it's showing now. In the wake of Putin's comments about forcing a transitional government and finishing off Ukraine if it disagrees, Trump said, "If Russia and I are unable to make a deal on stopping the bloodshed in Ukraine, and if I think it was Russia's fault, which it might not be, but if I think it was Russia's fault, I'm going to put secondary tariffs on oil coming out of Russia." Secondary tariffs? What does that mean? That would be that if you buy oil from Russia, you can't do business in the United States, Trump added. There will be a 25% tariff on all oil, a 25 to 50-point tariff on all oil. Trump outright said that he's pissed off with Russia's leader, with the new tariffs only adding to what the US has done to Russian oil since Putin's invasion. Shortly after Putin entered Ukraine, former US President Joe Biden banned all Russian oil imports into the country. Since that ban, Russia's sales to the US have plummeted to just 10,000 barrels of crude oil and petroleum products since 2023. For context, the US consumes about 20.25 million barrels of petroleum daily, meaning Russia's input is barely a fraction of what the US requires. Before the war started, the US bought an average of 209,000 barrels of crude oil and 500,000 barrels of petroleum products from Russia daily. The US has successfully cut Russia off from its massive oil purchasing. Now, Trump is threatening to decimate Russia's ability to sell to the countries that are buying from it by hanging the idea of lost trade with the US over their heads. That brings us to an obvious question. What impact would Trump's secondary oil tariffs on Russia really have? In the immediate sense, perhaps not as much of an impact as Trump might want. CNBC suggests that Trump's comments were supposed to increase oil prices while casting doubts about Russia's ability to continue serving its clients in the future. However, June Brent crude futures declined by 0.2%, amounting to 17 cents to $72.59 per barrel in the immediate wake of Trump's tariff suggestions. West Texas Intermediate, or WTI, which is a crude oil blend, also declined. It fell to $69.18 per barrel, a fall of 0.3% of 18 cents per barrel. This news is a mixed bag. On one hand, it means that both are practically flat and on track to record their first quarterly drops in 2 quarters. However, both are also on track to record their third consecutive weeks of gains, despite settling lower than they expected. Nomura Securities economist Yuki Takashima explained the situation to CNBC. Trump's comments were supposed to boost oil prices, but doubts about their feasibility and the upcoming OPEC Plus production increase starting in April are keeping investors cautious, Takashima said. OPEC Plus is a collection of 13 members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. That, along with 11 other nations that aren't part of OPEC, work together to ensure stability in the global crude oil market. Together, those countries control a little over 90% of the world's proven oil reserves, meaning any actions OPEC Plus takes have a massive impact on the global investment attitude surrounding crude oil. We expect WTI to stay in a range of $65 to $75 for now, as the market assesses the impact of Trump's tariffs on oil supply and global economy, as well as the supply situation from the US and OPEC+, Takashima added. His claims come as OPEC Plus is gearing up to announce a new program of monthly increases to oil production in April, of which Russia will be a part. So Trump may not have achieved his short-term goal of boosting oil prices for everybody but Russia with this announcement, but he has his sights set on a longer game. And to understand that game, we need to ask a question: just what are secondary tariffs? We're already familiar with regular tariffs thanks to Trump's massive implementation of them since he became US president. A normal tariff is essentially a tax charged on goods one country imports from another. For instance, Trump has placed tariffs on cars, steel, and aluminium from countries including Mexico, Canada, and China since he became president. Those tariffs typically add to the cost of a product based on a percentage. As the BBC explains, a 25% tariff on a $10 product would mean an additional $2.50 charge for exporting that product. A foreign company that sells a product to the US has to pay that tariff to the government. Trump believes his heavy use of traditional tariffs will push US consumers into buying American and reinvigorate the US manufacturing sectors. Whether that will happen or not remains to be seen. A secondary tariff, such as the one Trump is threatening to place against Russia's oil, is much different. As The Hill explains, the concept didn't really exist until Trump started throwing around threats to implement these types of tariffs. They amount to a monetary sanction on a country that trades with another nation against which the US is opposed. Take the Russian oil situation as an example. If Trump imposed a 25% tariff directly on Russian oil, it wouldn't have much of an impact. After all, the US is only buying 10,000 barrels of petroleum products from Russia daily. Russia having to pay an extra 25% on such a tiny fraction of its oil sales wouldn't have much of an impact. However, a tariff placed against countries that buy Russian oil would be far more damaging. Under Trump's proposal, those countries would have to pay a tariff on any goods they export to the US because they're supporting Putin's regime with their oil purchases. The idea is to punish both Russia and its allies with tariffs, hence the secondary designation. And we already have an example of how this will work. On March 24th, Trump signed an executive order targeting Venezuela with his new idea of secondary tariffs. That country, which is already under heavy US sanctions, can't really be hurt much by the US imposing direct tariffs on its products and services. So Trump is targeting Venezuela's allies. Any country that buys oil from Venezuela now has to pay a 25% tariff on any goods they export into the US. Given that 68% of Venezuela's exported oil goes to China, the secondary tariffs will add another 25% to the 20% blanket tariffs Trump has already enacted against China. And those tariffs add to the 10 to 25% tariffs Trump levied against China during his first term. So it's pain by association. In Russia's case, Trump is trying to hurt the Russian oil industry by making it practically impossible for Putin to continue selling to his allies. Anybody who buys Russian oil would have to pay a tariff on any goods they sell to the US. And given that the US is the largest goods importer in the world, having spent $3.2 trillion on other countries' products in 2022 alone, many of Russia's oil-buying partners may see the risk of secondary tariffs as a reason to stop doing business with Putin. It's a complex financial mechanism Trump aims to deploy against Putin. But what impact will it have on Russia and the world as a whole? For Russia, secondary tariffs could be devastating if they work in the way that Trump wants them to work. Oil is, and always has been, one of the key drivers of Russia's economy. Even in 2024, when the weight of Western sanctions against Putin's regime pushed oil exports down by 2.2%, Russia still sold 295.12 million tons of oil. Right now, a single barrel of oil costs $73.33. A single metric ton of crude oil equates to 6.99 barrels of foreign crude oil, giving us a cost per ton from a foreign nation like Russia of $512.57. Multiply that by the 295.12 million tons of oil sold by Russia in 2024, and you get over $151 billion. That's a lot of money potentially disappearing from Putin's coffers at a time when he's spending billions of dollars annually to fund his war. And the massive hit Russia's economy could take from its oil partners looking elsewhere due to Trump's secondary tariffs will only add to the pressure Russia's most important industry faces. By December 2024, Russia's oil production had already collapsed to a 20-year low, thanks to constant Ukrainian drone strikes against its energy infrastructure. The country averaged just 1,254 metric tons of crude oil production per day in 2024, a number that hasn't been seen since 2005. Given that Russia is the world's third largest oil producer, accounting for about 12% of global crude oil production, that decline was already having an impact on Putin's cash flow. Less oil produced means less oil to sell, of course. The decline comes in the wake of Ukraine hitting dozens of Russia's oil-producing sites, with Radio Free Europe suggesting that those attacks have caused around $714 million worth of damages as of March 29th. So Trump is trying to create a compounding effect against Putin now that he's so pissed off. He sees that Russia's oil industry is already ailing under widespread attacks by Ukraine. With his secondary tariffs, Trump is putting an even deeper squeeze on Russia. Putin, already struggling under sanctions and the Ukrainian attacks, now faces the prospect of struggling to find customers for his country's oil. Without those customers, Russia loses billions of dollars in sales and may even lose some of the crude oil it has in storage. After all, the oil doesn't stay in the same state forever. Its quality degrades over time, especially once refined into other products. Losing customers means Russia would have nowhere to send the oil it's already produced, potentially wasting billions of dollars more of the product as it struggles to sell. Add all of this to the fact that Trump's declaration that he's pissed off at Putin seems to mark the complete turnaround of Russia's relationship with the US. As Politico points out, it was only a couple of months ago that this relationship was starting to thaw out. Trump has suggested he was willing to ease sanctions placed against Russia, especially in the wake of the ceasefire negotiations he's been holding with Putin and Zelensky. Now that relationship seems to have been put back on ice, at least for the time being. Far from relieving sanctions, Trump is planning on using secondary tariffs to make Putin feel a world of economic pain. Russia's leader could never have expected this. However, you may have identified a small wrinkle in Trump's plan. The idea of secondary sanctions is all well and good except for one thing: the impact they'll have on the nations that buy Russia's oil, the European Union, or EU as an example. On February 25th, The Guardian reported that EU nations collectively spent $23.69 billion on Russian oil in 2024. That's over $3 billion more than the $20.56 billion that the EU provided in military aid to Ukraine during the same year. And therein lies a problem for Trump's secondary sanctions. They have the potential to massively impact some of the US's allies. In the EU's case, this may not come as a surprise. Trump has already threatened the group with direct tariffs. On March 27th, Trump said, "If the European Union works with Canada in order to do economic harm to the USA, large-scale tariffs, far larger than currently planned, will be placed on them both in order to protect the best friend that each of those two countries has ever had." If we disregard the fact that the EU isn't a country for a moment, Trump's secondary tariff decision could provide him with a backdoor to impose tariffs against the EU, but that may be the plan. The US has reduced its dependence on Russian oil substantially since Putin invaded Ukraine. The EU, though it's now spending less on Russian oil than it did in the past, is still lining Putin's pockets with billions of dollars per year. Vaibhav Raghunandan, who's a member of the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air that discovered the $23.69 billion oil spending figure, outlined it clearly. Purchasing Russian fossil fuels is, quite plainly, akin to sending financial aid to the Kremlin and enabling its invasion. It's a practice that must stop immediately to secure not just Ukraine's future, but also Europe's energy security. Perhaps Trump's secondary tariffs also have an ulterior motive. He'll hurt Russia by hitting the countries that buy from it, and at the same time he'll further his goal of making the EU, and Europe as a whole, more dependent on itself and less reliant on other nations for its survival. Trump is essentially putting the EU between a rock and a hard place with these new tariffs. Either it stops buying oil from Russia, or it gets hit with tariffs that impact its trade with the US. And given that the EU exported around $575 billion worth of goods to the US in 2024, the impact of these tariffs would be massive. They'll easily add another $150 billion or so to the prices of those exports, angering the EU and potentially creating a backlash against the US. But it's not just the EU that Trump has to worry about. We mentioned earlier that Russia accounts for around 12% of the world's crude oil production. Naturally, that means it has a lot of partners. Outside of the EU, Russia sells, in widely different volumes, to countries including Japan, South Korea, China, and India. It's the latter two that may present the biggest challenge to Trump's implementation of his secondary tariffs. Without them getting on board, Trump's idea could be dead in the water. Reuters highlights this in a March 30th article on Trump's oil threats. It says that Putin may back down from his extreme ceasefire negotiations stance if Trump follows through on his secondary tariffs. However, the US will also place India in a very uncomfortable position. As Reuters notes, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has so far adopted a stance of trying to appease Trump, with a proposal to scrap the import duty on US liquefied natural gas in order to boost purchases as an example. However, India has massively benefited from so much of the Western world shunning Russia's crude oil, the outlet says. It's been able to snap up barrels at bargain prices, reaching the point where it imports 1.52 million barrels per day, to account for 30% of its total oil arrivals. Given that India already isn't buying crude oil from Iran thanks to US sanctions placed against the nation, Trump's secondary tariffs risk hurting a nation that is still allied to the US, albeit one that's also attempting to stay neutral. Then there's China. China buys around 2 million barrels of Russian oil per day, both via seaborne routes and a pipeline from Russia to China. Its economy would be severely impacted by Trump's secondary sanctions. The risk for Beijing, Reuters says, is that an additional tariff of up to 50% on US imports from China, on top of the 20% already imposed by Trump, would bring about real levels of pain in its economy, which is already struggling to build momentum. Again, that's all part of Trump's plan. He wants countries buying oil from Russia to feel economic pain. That way, all of them stop buying Russia's oil, eliminating billions of dollars from Putin's war budget. The problem might emerge if India and China unite with other nations buying oil from Russia to essentially reject the secondary sanctions. They may continue buying Russian oil while exporting other ways to make themselves less dependent on the US for trade, causing problems for the US economy in the even longer term. Of course, that's all in the future. For now, Trump has sent a clear message to Putin: piss me off and I'll hit you hard. But he also sent another message, according to NBC. Trump said that he still has a very good relationship with Putin and that the anger dissipates quickly if he does the right thing. It's all negotiating pressure tactics by Trump, and given that Trump and Putin are scheduled to speak again at some point during the coming week, we may have just seen the US president pull off a masterstroke that could force Russia into the ceasefire Trump has angled for all along. But what do you think about Trump's threat of secondary sanctions against Russia? Will he follow through? What impact will these sanctions have on America's relationships with its allies and enemies that buy Russian oil? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for commentary on the latest developments in global geopolitics. Now go check out Putin Finally Betrays Trump, or click this other video instead.